Hello everyone, this is Marcel. Welcome back. So in my last video, it was basically just a massive summary of different types of mate selection in the animal kingdom, all the way from higher life forms down to insects. The various ways they interact and how they mate select and prevent other mates from getting with their previous mates. It was a pretty deep topic. If you haven't seen it already, I recommend you watching it first. I will put a link to it right here. So when I look at humanity and I apply the rules and patterns that I see in the animal kingdom to humanity, I see a certain number of things being the possibilities of what will happen. Now, normal, healthy hypergamy. Let me point out that I don't think that hypergamy is inherently bad or wrong. It's just female nature. It's human nature. If human society were acting normally within the animal kingdom, there would be a set of checks and balances put into play naturally that would allow it to find balance. Essentially that at some point when the requests became too extreme for the males to keep up, there would be a point where the females would back off a little bit. I mean, not all guys can afford a mansion. Not all guys can be perfect in every single way. Eventually, they're going to have to settle on something that they want. Even if you were to argue that one man could impregnate an unlimited supply of women, that many women would not be willing to share that one man, and his resources would eventually dwindle down, because we're not talking about purely genetics here. They all expect to get a top-tier man when there simply aren't enough of them to go around, and they're not willing to share them in most cases. At least not with the other 80% of women, right? There's going to have to be a balancing selection process. And all of that is going to be hingent on their desire to reproduce being greater than that of their demand on the male that they're choosing. It's sort of a built-in settling process to allow for survival of the species. Well, let's say for a moment that that weren't possible. Let's dissociate a little bit and say we're talking about some newly discovered species of orangutan, right? We're not talking about humans, we're talking about another higher form of primate. Well, if the demands for the female to choose the male were getting too extreme, like the tree house or the mud hut that he built, we're talking about orangutans here, became so ridiculous that it was almost impossible. At some point, a male is going to be born or created that's just going to say screw it and take what he wants and completely forget all of the other mating patterns and behaviors that were necessary in previous generations. He's going to do something completely new. Now, obviously, in human culture and society, that's considered an act of aggression. At least if we're talking about rape and not some other form of deviance. It's a violent act. It's a heinous act, and it is not tolerated. So let's say in that orangutan culture, it's not tolerated either. So that other monkey's thrown out. Well, if the system keeps going in the direction that it's headed, eventually the species is going to start to die off, either by a lack of genetic diversity, or there's not going to be enough of them that will meet the ever-increasing standards put on them under the assumption that the females are less interested in breeding than they are in receiving the resources that are acquired by the breeding process, by the whole mate selection courting system. So bringing it back into perspective here, I believe that's what's happening in humanity right now. The females of the species are more interested in acquiring the resources that are intrinsically ingrained into the courting process than they really are in reproduction in of itself. Now, the way that I'm looking at this, so you can kind of see it the way that I do for this discussion, is I'm grouping up, I'm lumping together things like child support, alimony, the guy losing his house, the court systems, all of that, rape culture in the sense that it's actually happening, like the component, not the feminist version of it, but the way that it's getting used and corrupted. Let's call it Me Too culture. How about that? I see all of that as reproductive mating rituals run amok. They've gone completely haywire. They've gone off the deep end. And it all has to do within at least this culture, with there not being any form of check and balance, that there's a desire of reproduction in the first place above that of the resources. Now we're getting into some familiar territory if you've been around MGTOW for a while, that the juice is not worth the squeeze. It's gotten to a point where their demands are so high of the male that the opportunity of reproductive access is not worth the sacrifice of partaking in it. Well, what would happen naturally in this system, and honestly could happen with humanity within our society, at least here in the United States, maybe some of the other countries as well, is that another culture that doesn't have such stringent rules regarding pair bonding will actually take over. A neighboring group of orangutans will step in and take over. You know, I didn't set up a pun with this or anything, but that is something that TFM talks about a lot. That other cultures are just going to step in and take everything, and that the females of the first culture are not going to stop them. If the system breaks, it breaks. They're going to trade up to the best deal they can get and move on. Nonetheless, with technological advances and the capabilities of freezing sperm, which is, you know, very underrated as far as what it's actually done for the capabilities of women getting to breed with who they want. I mean, think about that. They could pick the genetics of all of their future children, and no one would say a word to them. Heck, there's plenty of cucks out there who would willingly let them pick the sperm from the bank that they wanted, as long as they would be allowed to play the father role that they wanted to be in. Hell, they're out there getting with single mothers anyway. You see the proof right there in the pudding. But that 99% of that is completely disregarded because they're more interested in the rituals of dating. The money, the resources, the hypergamy, trading up for that better boyfriend is what it's all about now. And the genetic fitness is almost irrelevant, except on a subconscious level that they maybe don't want to admit to. You might almost make a correlation to similar patterns when it comes to diet, eating, where like 99% of the attention is focused on the taste of the food and kind of indulging that desire, that craving for the flavor, as opposed to even eating for survival anymore. I mean, how many people actually have to eat to live and worry about it? And how many of them, at least in American society, are just eating because they want to just shove their faces full of tasty food? I would surmise the same thing is happening in the dating world, that people are no longer dating to actually find a spouse or a loved one or somebody they can pair bond with. And 99% of it is all just about going out and hooking up, and the culture, the experience of just indulging that craving of getting the attention or the perks and resources that come from it. So in an effort to somewhat wrap up this rather lengthy conversation, why do I say that dating in the scheme of things is going out? Why do I say it's ending? Why do I say it's finished? Despite humanity's amazing technological advances, but despite all of their achievements and everything that they have put forth to put themselves where they are today, they are still inherently animals. They eat, they sleep, they breed. There is nothing magical about it. Now, you could argue the beauty in the existence of life and the concept of self-awareness, and I would agree with you, they are miraculous things. But humanity is still just an animal. And when a behavior in an animal society, no matter what the species is, stops producing any benefit for those involved, eventually it dies off, it fades out, it stops happening. It ceases to become a genetic advantage or a behavioral one if it's inheritable genetic in the first place. And other tools that actually work or give an advantage will be trained in or bred in. An example of this could be pickup culture. I don't see dating and the process of pair bonding in the way that it's being presented now in our society as being any kind of an advantage. And I am connecting all of the other behaviors like marriage and pair bonding and all of that along with the process of dating. Courting rituals as a whole. I don't see it getting men any better reproductive rights. In fact, far more often, it's not even their kid that gets produced from the couplings that they've been working so hard towards. Half the time, if it's not a roll of the dice, it's almost guaranteed not to be their kid because, you know, what woman wants a kid from a beta? They'd rather have a kid from some alpha male. A Chad and a Tyrone, but Chads don't pay the bills. Now maybe a guy going out and, you know, going to dinner with women and stuff is more cultural. I could buy that it's trained into them from birth and has little to do with genetics. But you know what? The emotional drive for a guy to take care of his family, that urge to run out and save a female in duress, how much you want to bet the whole white knight behavior is partially genetic? A lot of these behavioral traits that women take for granted in men are genetic. They've provided an advantage in the past for humanity for that family to survive, but they're no longer being positively reinforced. So what happens when they get bred out? Now I can hear it already. Oh, Marcel, it takes millions of years for genetic changes, at least thousands, before anything noticeable would happen. I will agree that there is amounts of random chance that does play part in that, but for the most part, if women, for example, stopped wanting to date anybody with blue eyes, they could eliminate blue-eyed people in a little over a generation. And a lot of these behaviors, I'm not willing to gamble that every last one of them is learned and non-genetic. I think a lot more of them are genetic than people are willing to admit. But I've already covered that pretty heavily in a previous video. So simply put, as a summary, when behavioral patterns stop paying off, when they stop giving a species a genetic advantage, the fitness that they would have originally, then they stop getting performed. If it's physical, then nature finds a way around it. If it's cultural or behavioral, then the species or nature finds a way around it, or the species dies. At least assuming those checks and balance we covered a few times aren't in play. Well, I don't realistically think that humanity is not going to survive. 1,001 sperm banks that would be more than happy to impregnate a woman if every guy in the world turned their back on her. But like we discussed, it's not about reproduction, it's about resources now. Extreme divergent behaviors in these kind of situations are completely natural and part of the system. I am starting to find this more interesting every single day. Humanity is like a giant petri dish I can sort of sit back and watch to see how it all plays out. Now, I get that that might be kind of a strange way for me to put it, but the secret is you just don't wallow in the petri dish. You step back and you watch it, but you don't sit in it. As always, this kind of ties into MGTOW. In any other run-amok system, as we've discussed, it would find a balancing point, a tipping point where things would be pulled back into perspective. But in our culture right now, it can't. Things like misogyny or something else that would possibly balance it out is being suppressed at a massive scale. Any form of deviance, in fact, that goes beyond the feminist agenda is going to be suppressed, at least as well as they're able. So, you know, when you back guys into corners harder and harder, eventually they're going to step away. The final thought here, despite all of the shaming language and the brutal mocking and whatever garbage that, you know, traditional people or somebody that just disagrees with MGTOW is going to throw at us, feminists especially, a behavioral or cultural shift to get around back to something that actually works or away from something that doesn't is ingrained into almost every species because it means survival. And certain people can scoff all they want, but the treatment of some men out there is actually getting lethal. So I'm going to cut this topic off right about here. Was this interesting? Do you agree with it? Disagree? Do you think I'm full of shit? I want to know. Be brutally honest down below. I hope to see you again soon. Until next time, this has been Marcel. Oh, and before I forget, I made a couple of really awesome videos. They were specifically movie reviews. And what I did is I used the trailers in the background of the video in sort of like a cool line art sort of style. It looked really nice, but no matter how many filters, no matter how many editings I did to the footage, it was constantly getting copyright strikes on it, or copyright claims, rather. Now, I can handle getting demonetized to a degree, but the idea of somebody else spamming ads on a video that I put all that sweat and blood into just royally pissed me off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those videos, the movie reviews that I made, and I'm going to put them on my Patreon where they really can't do anything about it. I mean, if it's getting to a point where I can't even put like pictures in the background that happen to be of images from the movie, you know, I'll give it a shot. I'll see what I can come up with if I can get them on my main channel. But otherwise, they're going to be there. So if you want to see them now, That's where you're going to find them. Until next time, like, share, and subscribe. This has been Marcel.